The morning sun cast long shadows across the "Welcome to Riverdale" sign as a dusty blue Jeep Wrangler rumbled past. Behind the wheel sat Thomas Wilson, his dark hands gripping the steering wheel with a mix of excitement and nervousness. The Jeep had seen better days, but it shined with the care of someone who treasured it beyond its market value. Thomas glanced at the photo taped to his dashboard, an old picture of his father standing proudly next to this very same Jeep 30 years ago. "We made it, Dad," he whispered, allowing himself a rare smile. After 20 years working his way up through the ranks in Chicago's police force, Thomas had finally accepted the position of police chief in Riverdale. The small town needed fresh leadership, and Thomas needed a change. Too many late nights, too many politics, too many funerals of young men who looked like him. He decided to arrive a week before his official start date. "Know the town before you try to protect it," his father had always said. His father had been one of the first black officers in their district back in the 1970s. The Jeep had been his, passed down to Thomas when cancer took him 5 years ago. Thomas pulled into a gas station on the edge of town. The attendant, an older white man with weathered hands, looked up from his newspaper. "Nice Jeep," the man said, walking out to help. "Don't see many classics kept up this nice." "Thanks," Thomas replied. "It was my father's." "You just passing through?" the attendant asked, eyeing the out-of-state plates. Thomas hesitated. He wasn't ready to announce himself as the new police chief yet. He wanted to see Riverdale as it really was, not how people would present it to the boss. "Staying a while," Thomas answered vaguely. "Any good places to get a room around here?" The gas station attendant recommended the Pine View Motel on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and quiet, perfect for someone who wanted to keep a low profile. The motel room was simple but comfortable enough. Thomas unpacked his few belongings, hanging up the suit he would wear on Monday for his first official day. The framed photo of his father went on the nightstand. After a quick shower, Thomas decided to explore downtown Riverdale on foot. Main Street was like something from another time. Small shops with hand-painted signs, a diner with chrome fixtures, and a town square with a gazebo. People nodded as he passed, some friendly, others curious about the unfamiliar face. Thomas stopped at the diner for lunch, sliding into a booth by the window where he could watch the street. The waitress brought him a menu and a knowing smile. "You must be new in town," she said. "We don't get many visitors this time of year." "Just getting to know the place," Thomas replied, ordering a coffee and the daily special. As he ate, Thomas observed the rhythm of the town. A patrol car cruised slowly down Main Street. 2 officers inside, laughing about something. They didn't look his way. Thomas watched them carefully, wondering what kind of department he was inheriting. After lunch, Thomas walked past the Riverdale Police Department, his future workplace. It was a red brick building with white columns, American flag hanging limply in the windless afternoon. Through the windows, he could see officers moving about, going through the motions of small-town policing. None of them knew that the man in jeans and a Chicago Bears t-shirt standing across the street would be sitting in the chief's office next week. Thomas spent the rest of the afternoon walking Riverdale's neighborhoods, from the manicured lawns of Oakwood Heights to the more modest homes on the south side. He noted the invisible lines that seemed to separate different communities, how the patrol cars drove slower through some areas than others. By evening, Thomas returned to his Jeep and drove to a local supermarket to stock his motel room's mini fridge. As he loaded grocery bags into the back, he overheard a group of teenagers talking nearby. "That's the 3rd time this month they've stopped my brother for nothing," one boy said, "just because he drives that old Honda." Thomas's ears perked up. He pretended to organize his groceries while listening. "My dad says just don't give them a reason," another replied, "especially if you're not from here." Thomas drove back to the motel with much to think about. He parked his Jeep under a flickering light in the parking lot, unaware that this cherished vehicle would soon become the center of a storm that would shake Riverdale to its core. Inside his room, Thomas laid out his notes from the day and added new observations. He had 1 week to understand Riverdale before revealing himself as the new chief. 1 week to see the truth of the department he was about to lead. He fell asleep that night with his father's photo watching over him, not knowing that some of his future officers were already taking notice of the out-of-state Jeep with a black man behind the wheel. 3 days had passed since Thomas arrived in Riverdale. He was starting to recognize faces around town: the baker who opened at dawn, the librarian who walked her golden retriever at lunch, and the mail carrier who whistled the same tune every afternoon. Yet he still kept to himself, watching and learning. The night air felt heavy with coming rain as Thomas parked his blue Jeep Wrangler in front of Ray's Diner. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a red glow across the hood of his father's old vehicle. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried food wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. "Evening," said the older waitress behind the counter. "Back again? You must like our apple pie." Thomas nodded with a smile. "Best I've had since my grandmother's." He settled into a corner booth where he could see both the street and the other customers. A family with 2 sleepy children sat near the window. An elderly couple shared a milkshake with 2 straws. At the counter, a young woman in a Riverdale Community College sweatshirt tapped away at her laptop. Thomas ordered his usual black coffee and a slice of apple pie and pulled out a notebook. He'd been jotting down observations about the town, things he'd want to address once he officially took over as chief. The notebook was already filling up with notes about patrol patterns, community engagement opportunities, and questions about department policies. Outside the diner's large windows, a patrol car cruised slowly past. It wasn't the first time Thomas had seen it tonight. The same car had driven by twice before in the last hour. This time, it slowed almost to a stop as it passed his Jeep. Thomas watched from behind his coffee cup as the officers inside pointed at his vehicle. The patrol car disappeared around the corner, but something in Thomas's gut told him they'd be back. 20 years of police work had taught him to trust that feeling. An hour later, Thomas paid his bill and left a generous tip. The rain had started, a light drizzle that darkened the pavement and made the streetlights blur. He stepped out under the diner's awning and paused, keys in hand. Across the street, partially hidden in the shadows of the closed hardware store, sat the patrol car. 2 officers were inside, but Thomas could make out at least 2 more standing near his Jeep in the dark. His heart sank. He knew what was happening even before he saw one of them bend down near his tire. The college student from the diner stepped out behind him, pulling up her hood against the rain. She froze when she saw what was happening across the street. Without thinking, she pulled out her phone and began recording. "What are they doing?" she whispered. Thomas put a finger to his lips, warning her to stay quiet. They watched as the 4 officers surrounded his Jeep. One slashed the back tires with a pocket knife. Another used keys to scratch something into the paint. The tallest one, wearing a baseball cap pulled low, broke the left taillight with his baton. The girl's hand trembled as she recorded, but she kept the camera steady enough. "This isn't right," she whispered. "No, it's not," Thomas agreed quietly, his voice tight with controlled anger. The officers were laughing now, shoving each other playfully as they admired their handiwork. One of them, a stocky man with a swagger in his step, slapped something against the windshield. A note. Then they were back in their patrol car, driving away with headlights off until they reached the corner. Thomas waited until they were gone before crossing the street to his Jeep. The girl followed, still recording. "You should report this," she said. Thomas stared at the damage with a heaviness in his chest. His father's Jeep, the one thing he had left of him, now sat with 2 flat tires, deep scratches forming a crude word on the door, and a broken taillight that reminded him of a wounded eye. He pulled the paper from under the windshield wiper. The note read, "We don't like your kind around here. Move along before things get worse." Thomas carefully folded the note and put it in his pocket. Evidence. "I'm Kelly," the college student said, finally lowering her phone. "I got most of it on video. Not great in the dark, but you can see their uniforms." Thomas nodded. "Thank you, Kelly. This might be very important." "Are you going to the police?" she asked, then laughed without humor. "I mean, obviously that won't help." Rain fell harder now, washing over the vandalized Jeep. Thomas ran his hand along the scratched paint, feeling each groove like a wound. "I am going to handle this," he said finally, "but not how they expect." Kelly looked confused. "What do you mean?" Thomas smiled grimly as raindrops rolled down his face like tears. "Let's just say they picked the wrong Jeep to mess with." Morning light revealed the full extent of the damage to Thomas's Jeep. What looked bad in the rainy darkness last night looked even worse under the bright sun. The slashed tires hung sadly on their rims. The scratches on the door spelled out, "Go home," in jagged letters. The broken taillight glass sparkled on the pavement like forgotten jewels. Thomas ran his hand over the damaged door, feeling each groove cut into the paint his father had so carefully maintained. He took pictures with his phone, documenting everything from multiple angles. 20 years in law enforcement had taught him the importance of evidence. "I'm really sorry about your Jeep," Kelly said, approaching from the motel office. She had offered to give Thomas a ride to the nearest tire shop after he'd had the Jeep towed back to the motel last night. "I appreciate your help," Thomas replied, tucking his phone away, "and thank you for the video." Kelly nodded, looking around nervously. "I haven't shown it to anyone else. Honestly, I'm a little scared. Everyone knows everyone in this town." "You did the right thing," Thomas assured her. "I won't forget it." After getting 2 new tires installed at the local shop, where the owner raised his eyebrows but asked no questions, Thomas drove his wounded Jeep to the Riverdale Police Department. The building seemed different in daylight, less imposing, more worn around the edges, just like the officers who worked there, Thomas thought. The front desk was staffed by an older man with graying hair and a nameplate reading, "Sage Reynolds." He barely looked up from his computer when Thomas approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd rather not. "I need to file a report," Thomas said, placing photos of his vandalized Jeep on the counter. "Someone damaged my vehicle last night while it was parked outside Ray's Diner." The sergeant glanced at the photos without touching them. His expression didn't change, but Thomas noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. "That's some bad luck," he said finally. "Probably just kids causing trouble. Happens sometimes to out-of-towners." "It wasn't kids," Thomas said evenly. "There were 4 adults, all wearing Riverdale Police Department uniforms." The sergeant's head snapped up, eyes suddenly sharp. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation, it's a fact." "You got any proof of that?" the sergeant challenged. Thomas considered mentioning Kelly's video but decided against it. Something told him to keep that card close to his chest. "Just what I saw," he replied instead. Sergeant Reynolds sighed and pulled out a form. "I'll take your report, but don't expect much. Without evidence, it's just your word." Thomas watched as the sergeant filled out the form with deliberate slowness, misspelling Thomas's name even after being corrected twice. When finished, he handed Thomas a carbon copy with a case number scribbled at the top. "We'll look into it," he said in a tone that suggested precisely the opposite. Outside the station, Thomas stood on the steps, studying the report. The case number was barely legible, and his statement had been simplified to "claimant alleges unknown person's damaged vehicle." As he folded the paper and put it in his pocket, Thomas noticed Kelly waiting across the street, half hidden behind a newspaper stand. "How did it go?" she asked when he approached. "Exactly how I expected," Thomas replied. "They have no intention of investigating." Kelly looked down at her shoes. "That's how it always is here. That's why nobody reports anything anymore." She hesitated, then added, "Those officers who did this, they've done worse before. Everyone knows it, but nobody talks about it." "Tell me more," Thomas said. They walked to a small park where Kelly spoke quietly about incidents she'd heard about, visitors hassled at traffic stops, complaints that disappeared, people who left town suddenly after encounters with certain officers. The 4 from last night. Officers Perry, Davis, Thompson, and Rodriguez, they're always together, even off duty, like a gang with badges. Thomas committed the names to memory. Has anyone ever stood up to them? Kelly shook her head. The last chief let them do whatever they wanted. Rumor is the new chief starting next week is some hotshot from Chicago, but she shrugged. New boss, same problems, right? Thomas gave a small smile. We'll see about that. Later, back in his motel room, Thomas spread everything on the bed, his notes, the photos, the police report, and a notepad where he'd written the 4 officers' names. He added details from Kelly's stories and his own observations. Then he pulled out his phone and opened the email he'd received last month. The official offer letter from Riverdale's mayor confirming his appointment as the new chief of police, effective Monday morning, 3 days from now. Thomas touched the small framed photo of his father that sat on the nightstand. "Don't worry, Dad," he said quietly. "Your Jeep won't go unavenged." Thomas woke before dawn the next morning, his mind already working on his plan. He had 2 days left before everyone would know who he really was. 2 days to gather enough evidence that those officers couldn't wriggle out of what they'd done. He dressed in jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, clothes that wouldn't draw attention. The scratches on his Jeep door were now covered with duct tape. Not pretty, but less noticeable than the hateful words underneath. His first stop was the coffee shop across from the police station. From a corner table by the window, Thomas could see officers coming and going. He ordered a black coffee and settled in with a newspaper, watching over the edge of the sports section. Around 7:30 a.m. he spotted them, Officers Perry and Thompson arriving for the morning shift. Perry was tall with broad shoulders and a swagger that screamed overconfidence. Thompson was shorter, always a half step behind Perry like a shadow. They laughed about something as they entered the station, completely at ease. Thomas made notes in a small notebook. Times, behaviors, who they talked to. Simple detective work. When the lunch rush started, Thomas moved to Ray's Diner, the scene of the crime. The friendly waitress remembered him. "Your Jeep got hit pretty bad, huh?" she asked, filling his coffee cup. "Word gets around fast in Riverdale." "Yeah, it does," Thomas agreed. "I'm curious. Those officers who come in here sometimes, the ones always together. What can you tell me about them?" The waitress looked around before leaning closer. "They're trouble," she whispered. "Been that way for years. Always free food and coffee for them. Not because we want to give it, if you catch my meaning." "Protection money," Thomas said quietly. She nodded. "Nobody says anything because, well, who would we tell? They are the police." Thomas thanked her for the information. As he paid his bill, he asked one more question. "Do you have security cameras outside?" "One," she pointed to a camera above the entrance. "Owner installed it last year after some windows got broken. Would that camera have caught what happened to my Jeep the other night?" 20 minutes later, Thomas walked out with a copy of the security footage on his phone. The quality wasn't great, but it clearly showed police officers damaging his vehicle. His next stop was the hardware store across from the diner. The owner there was harder to convince, but eventually showed Thomas footage from his security camera too, a different angle of the same incident. By mid-afternoon, Thomas had spoken with 6 business owners around town. 4 had security cameras. 3 had footage from that night. And almost everyone had a story about Officers Perry, Davis, Thompson, and Rodriguez. The barbershop owner described how they demanded free haircuts. The grocery store manager talked about food that disappeared from shelves when they visited. The gas station attendant mentioned how they never paid for snacks or coffee. Thomas took careful notes of each conversation, building a picture of 4 officers who had been allowed to operate without consequences for far too long. Around 4 p.m., Thomas parked across from the police station again, watching as the shift changed. He saw Officer Davis emerge, followed shortly by Rodriguez. They climbed into Davis's pickup truck rather than a patrol car, off-duty now. Thomas followed them at a safe distance as they drove to a bar on the edge of town called the Blue Line. He waited 15 minutes before entering himself. The bar was dimly lit, with police memorabilia covering the walls. Thomas took a seat at the far end of the bar, ordered a soda, and watched. Davis and Rodriguez had joined Perry and Thompson, who must have finished their shifts earlier. The 4 officers commanded the largest table, their loud laughter cutting through the music. Other patrons gave them plenty of space. As Thomas sipped his drink, he overheard their conversation. "Did you see that report this morning?" Perry laughed. "Some out-of-towner claiming cops messed up his Jeep." "Reynolds buried it," Thompson replied. "Like always." "Here's to Reynolds." Davis raised his glass. "Man knows how to take care of his own." They clinked glasses, completely unaware that their new boss was sitting just 30 feet away, recording every word on his phone. Thomas stayed for another hour, nursing his soda while the officers got louder and their stories more revealing. They bragged about other incidents, cars they'd ticketed for no reason, people they'd scared out of town, complaints that disappeared. When he finally left, Thomas had what he needed. Back in his motel room, he organized all his evidence, the security videos, his recordings from the bar, statements from business owners, and his own detailed notes. He saved everything to a secure cloud drive, then copied it all onto a USB drive as backup. Thomas looked at the damaged photo of his father that sat on the nightstand. The frame had cracked when he knocked it over after seeing his vandalized Jeep. "Justice is coming, Dad," he whispered, "just not the way they expect it." Monday morning arrived with golden sunshine that belied Thomas's nervousness. He stood in front of the mirror in his motel room, adjusting his tie for the 5th time. The crisp blue suit, the one he'd worn to his father's funeral, now served a different purpose. "Today's the day," he said to his reflection. His damaged Jeep had been cleaned up as best as possible. The scratched writing was now covered with black tape, the tires replaced, though the broken taillight remained unfixed, a deliberate choice. Thomas wanted to remember what had been done when he faced the officers responsible. At 8:15 a.m., Thomas drove to the town hall, where Mayor Wilson waited on the steps. The older man smiled broadly and extended his hand. "Chief Wilson, so good to finally meet you in person," the mayor said. "I hope you've had a chance to settle in over the weekend." "I've certainly gotten to know the town," Thomas replied, shaking his hand. "I've learned quite a lot about Riverdale already." The mayor led him inside to a small conference room where coffee and pastries waited. "The whole department will assemble at 9. I'll introduce you, you can say a few words, and then the official swearing in will take place." Thomas nodded, placing his briefcase on the table. Inside were the USB drive and printed copies of all the evidence he'd gathered. "I'm looking forward to meeting everyone." "I should warn you," the mayor lowered his voice, "change doesn't always come easy in small towns. Some of the officers have been here their entire careers, set in their ways, if you know what I mean." "I understand completely," Thomas said. "I'm prepared for resistance." At 8:55, they walked together to the police department. The station's main room had been rearranged, with chairs set up facing a small podium. Officers filled most seats already, talking among themselves. Thomas stood at the back, watching as the last few stragglers arrived. Then he saw them, Officers Perry, Davis, Thompson, and Rodriguez entering together, laughing about something private. They took seats in the back row, still unaware of who Thomas was. Mayor Wilson stepped up to the podium at exactly 9 o'clock. The room fell silent. "Good morning, everyone. Today marks a new chapter for the Riverdale Police Department. After Chief Brooks's retirement last month, we conducted a nationwide search for someone who could bring fresh perspectives while understanding the unique needs of a community like ours." Thomas studied the 4 officers as the mayor spoke. They looked bored, checking their phones, barely paying attention. "Our new chief comes to us with over 20 years of distinguished service in Chicago. His record speaks for itself, commendations for bravery, innovative community policing programs, and the respect of everyone who's worked with him." Officer Perry whispered something to Thompson, who snickered. Davis checked his watch impatiently. "Without further delay, I'm proud to introduce your new chief of police, Thomas Wilson." Thomas stepped forward, walking slowly down the center aisle toward the podium. He kept his eyes fixed on the 4 officers in the back, watching as confusion gave way to recognition, then shock, and finally fear. Perry's mouth fell open. Thompson suddenly sat up straight. Davis dropped his phone. Rodriguez's face drained of color. The rest of the room applauded politely, unaware of the silent drama playing out in the back row. Thomas reached the podium and shook the mayor's hand. He turned to face the department, his department now, and let his gaze linger briefly on each of the 4 men who had vandalized his Jeep. "Thank you, Mayor Wilson, for that kind introduction, and thank you to everyone here for the welcome." His voice was calm, professional, betraying none of the emotion churning inside him. "I believe in 3 core principles for effective policing," Thomas continued: integrity, accountability, and community trust. Without these foundations, we cannot fulfill our oath to protect and serve. The 4 officers squirmed in their seats. Thompson looked like he might be sick. "I've spent the last few days getting to know Riverdale, walking your streets, meeting your people, observing how this department operates when no one thinks the boss is watching." A murmur rippled through the room. The other officers looked confused, but Perry, Davis, Thompson, and Rodriguez exchanged panicked glances. "Some of you may have heard about an incident involving an out-of-town visitor whose Jeep was vandalized while parked outside Ray's Diner last week." Thomas said, his eyes never leaving the four men. "That case will be my first priority as your new chief." Officer Rodriguez stared at the floor. Perry's jaw clenched. Davis wiped sweat from his forehead. Thompson looked desperately toward the door, as if calculating his escape route. Thomas allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "I'm looking forward to working closely with each and every one of you, especially those of you who might have insights into that particular case." After the ceremony ended, Thomas shook hands with the other officers as they filed out of the room. He noticed how Perry, Davis, Thompson, and Rodriguez tried to slip away quietly, huddled together like schoolboys caught in mischief. "Officers," Thomas called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "A word in my office, please." The four men froze. Thomas watched as they exchanged nervous glances before slowly turning around. The other officers cleared a path, curious about what their new chief wanted with these particular men. "Now?" Officer Perry asked, his usual confidence noticeably absent. "Yes, right now," Thomas replied calmly. He turned to the department secretary. "We'll need privacy. No calls or interruptions, please." Thomas led the way to his new office, a modest room with windows overlooking Main Street. His personal items were still in boxes by the desk, except for the framed photo of his father, which he'd already placed prominently on his desk. The four officers shuffled in awkwardly. Thomas closed the door behind them. "Stand there," he said, pointing to the space in front of his desk. For a long moment, Thomas simply looked at them, letting the silence grow uncomfortable. He studied each face, Perry's defiance, Thompson's fear, Davis's confusion, and Rodriguez's shame. "Do you know why you're here?" Thomas finally asked. Perry, clearly the group's leader, attempted to regain his composure. "Sir, if this is about welcoming you to the department." Thomas held up his hand, stopping Perry mid-sentence. Without a word, he picked up a remote control and turned on a small TV mounted on the wall. The security footage from Ray's diner began to play, clearly showing all four officers vandalizing his Jeep. "That's my Jeep," Thomas said quietly. "The one my father left me when he died." The color drained from Thompson's face. Davis stared at the floor. Rodriguez closed his eyes briefly, as if wishing he could disappear. "Chief, we didn't know," Perry started. "That I was your new boss." Thomas finished for him. "Would it have made a difference, or would you have just picked someone else's vehicle to vandalize?" None of them answered. Thomas reached into his briefcase and pulled out 4 files, placing them on his desk. "I spent the weekend doing some research. Officer Perry, 3 complaints for excessive force, all mysteriously dropped. Officer Davis, multiple reports of harassment from local business owners. Officer Thompson, 2 drunk driving incidents covered up by the previous administration. And Officer Rodriguez, a history of targeting out-of-town visitors with unnecessary tickets and searches." "How did you?" Thompson began, but fell silent when Perry shot him a warning look. "I was a detective for 12 years before I became an administrator," Thomas said. "Finding patterns is what I do." He tapped the files with his finger. "I have options here. I could fire all 4 of you immediately for vandalism, harassment, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The evidence is clear. You'd lose your badges, your pensions, everything." The 4 men stood frozen, waiting for the axe to fall. "But that's not why I came to Riverdale," Thomas continued. "I came here to make changes, not to destroy careers on my first day." He walked around his desk and leaned against it, facing them directly. "So here's what's going to happen. Each of you has a choice to make today." Thomas pointed to a letter on his desk. "Option 1. You sign your resignation, effective immediately. You walk away with your record intact. No charges, no public scandal." Perry crossed his arms defensively. "And option 2. You stay and work under my new program," Thomas said. "It won't be easy. You'll take sensitivity training. You'll work community service hours, off the clock, unpaid. You'll meet weekly with people from the neighborhoods you've harmed. You'll be on probation for 6 months, and I'll personally review every action you take." Rodriguez looked up, surprised. "You give us a second chance? After what we did to your Jeep?" Thomas picked up the photo of his father. "My dad was one of the first black officers in his department back in the 60s. The stories he told me about what he faced, much worse than what you did to my Jeep. But he stayed because he believed one good cop could make a difference. He set the photo down carefully. He taught me that real change doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from giving people the chance to do better, to be better. Thomas looked each man in the eye. So that's your choice. Resign now or commit to being the officers this town deserves. You have until the end of the day to decide. The 4 officers stood silently, the weight of their actions and their futures hanging in the balance. Dismissed, Thomas said quietly. 6 months passed like the seasons changing. Gradually, then suddenly it was done. The winter snow had melted and spring flowers bloomed along Riverdale's Main Street. Thomas stood by the window in his office, sipping coffee from a mug that read, "World's Most Patient Boss," a gag gift from the department's secretary. His restored Jeep sat in a parking spot marked Chief, gleaming under the morning sun. The scratches were gone, the taillight fixed, the tires replaced. But Thomas hadn't forgotten what happened that night. Neither had the town. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Officers Thompson and Rodriguez entered, followed by Officer Davis. All 3 men stood straighter now, their uniforms crisp and properly worn. The change wasn't just in their appearance. Their eyes showed something that hadn't been there 6 months ago: respect. "Progress reports," Chief Thompson said, placing 3 folders on Thomas's desk. Thomas nodded. "And how did yesterday's community meeting go?" "Good turnout," Rodriguez replied. "About 30 people came. They actually applauded when we finished presenting the new complaint system." The high school kids asked tough questions, Davis added with a small smile. "But fair ones." Thomas flipped through the folders. Detailed accounts of their community service hours, training completion certificates, and evaluations from citizens they'd worked with. The transformation wasn't perfect, but it was real. "Where's Officer Perry today?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. The 3 men exchanged glances. "Still at the Blue Line, last we heard," Thompson said quietly. "He's been there most nights since he turned in his badge." Perry had been the only one to choose resignation over reform. His pride wouldn't let him serve under Thomas or admit he needed to change. Last Thomas heard, Perry was telling anyone who would listen that he'd been forced out by political correctness. His choice, Thomas said simply. He closed the folders and looked at the 3 remaining officers. "Your probation ends today. You've met every requirement I set. The question is, what happens tomorrow?" The men looked at each other before Davis spoke up. "We want to keep doing the community meetings, Chief, even without the probation requiring it. And the mentorship program at the high school," Rodriguez added. "Those kids are starting to trust us now." Thomas smiled. Real change wasn't just about following orders, it was about changing hearts. Approved on both counts. You're good officers when you choose to be. As they turned to leave, Kelly, the college student who had recorded the vandalism that night, passed them on her way in. Now wearing an intern badge, she juggled an armful of papers and a laptop. "The community survey results are in," she announced, placing the data on Thomas's desk. "Approval ratings for the department are up 62% since you took over." Thomas looked through the results with satisfaction. "And the town council?" "They approved the body camera budget unanimously," Kelly grinned. "Even old Mr. Henderson voted yes, and he hasn't approved a spending increase in 15 years. Outside the window, Thomas could see Officer Thompson helping an elderly woman with her groceries, not because anyone was watching, but because it was the right thing to do. Later that afternoon, Thomas drove his Jeep to the cemetery on the edge of town. He placed a small stone on his father's headstone, a tradition they'd shared when visiting his grandfather's grave years ago. "We're making progress, Dad," Thomas said quietly. "Not perfect, but better every day." The breeze rustled through the trees as Thomas told his father about the changes in Riverdale, the new citizen review board, the community engagement programs, the officers who had found their way back to the true meaning of their badge. He saved the best news for last. "Remember Mrs. Washington's boy? The one who got arrested every time he came home to visit? He's applying to the police academy. Says he wants to join the department and be part of the change." Thomas ran his hand along the smooth hood of the Jeep, the same vehicle that had brought him to Riverdale and unwittingly sparked a transformation. "Sometimes good things come from the worst moments," he said softly. "You taught me that." Back at the station, Thomas parked in his usual spot. Through the windows, he could see his officers, not just Rodriguez, Thompson, and Davis, but all of them gathered around a table, planning the next community outreach event. As Thomas walked toward the building, his phone buzzed with a text from the mayor. 4 neighboring towns want to know your secret. Their chiefs are coming next week to learn about the Riverdale model. Thomas smiled. Change was spreading, just like his father would have wanted. In the station's lobby hung a new framed photo. Thomas's damaged Jeep from 6 months ago next to a group picture of the department today. Underneath, a simple caption read, "Sometimes the journey to justice starts with 4 flat tires."